The deadliest assassins in history weren't soldiers or kings. They were invisible killers that struck without warning and nearly erased entire civilizations. The Plague of Athens struck during the Peloponnesian War, devastating the Greek city-state at the height of its power and potentially changing the course of Western civilization. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 of Athens' population, including the great statesman Pericles. Thucydides, the famous historian who survived the plague, described symptoms including high fever, severe headache, inflamed eyes, bleeding tongue and throat, coughing, vomiting, and in later stages, skin pustules and severe diarrhea. Modern scholars debate the exact cause. Possibilities include typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, or even Ebola. The plague arrived during Athens' siege by Sparta, when rural populations had crowded into the city for protection, creating perfect conditions for disease spread. The demographic and psychological impact was catastrophic. Athens lost its military advantage, its democratic institutions weakened, and social order collapsed as people abandoned traditional morality in the face of death. The plague effectively ended Athens' golden age and its dreams of empire. Some historians argue that without this plague, Athenian democracy might have spread earlier and more widely, potentially changing the entire trajectory of Western political development. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox or measles, struck the Roman Empire at the height of its power and nearly brought down the ancient world's greatest civilization. Named after Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the plague killed an estimated 5 million people, including the emperor himself. Roman legions returning from campaigns in the east brought the disease back to Rome, where it spread rapidly through the empire's extensive road network. The plague devastated the Roman military, crippling their ability to defend borders against barbarian invasions. Economic collapse followed as trade routes were abandoned and agricultural production plummeted. The demographic catastrophe was so severe that entire regions were depopulated, and the empire never fully recovered its previous strength. Historians now recognize this plague as a major factor in Rome's eventual decline, weakening the empire's foundations centuries before its final fall. The plague also accelerated the spread of Christianity, as traditional Roman religious practices failed to provide comfort, while Christian communities cared for the sick and dying, gaining converts through their compassion. Named after Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage who described it, the plague of Cyprian struck the Roman Empire during a period of political chaos known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. The exact pathogen remains unknown, but symptoms included severe diarrhea, vomiting, throat ulcers, and fever, suggesting possibly measles, smallpox, or even a viral hemorrhagic fever like Ebola. The plague killed an estimated 5,000 people daily in Rome at its peak. Unlike other plagues that came and went, this one persisted for over a decade, continuously weakening the empire. The plague coincided with barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse, creating a perfect storm that nearly destroyed Roman civilization. Entire cities were abandoned, and the military was so depleted that Rome struggled to defend its borders. The demographic collapse was so severe that Emperor Decius began persecuting Christians, partly to appease the gods he believed were punishing Rome. Ironically, the plague accelerated Christianity's growth, as Christian communities provided care for the sick, while traditional Roman society collapsed. The plague's timing made it particularly devastating. It struck an empire already in crisis and pushed it to the absolute brink of dissolution. The first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, the Justinian Plague, struck the Byzantine Empire just as Emperor Justinian I was attempting to restore Roman glory. The same Yersinia pestis bacterium that would later cause the Black Death killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean world. Constantinople, the empire's capital, lost perhaps 40% of its population. The plague arrived from Egypt via grain ships, spreading along trade routes throughout the empire. Justinian's ambitious military campaigns to reconquer former Roman territories ground to a halt as armies were decimated by disease. The empire's economy collapsed as tax revenues plummeted and agricultural production ceased in many regions. Unlike later plagues, this one struck a civilization that was already politically unstable, making recovery even more difficult. The plague effectively ended the last real attempt to restore the Roman Empire and left the Byzantine Empire permanently weakened. It also facilitated the rise of Islam, as the plague weakened Byzantine and Persian empires couldn't resist Arab expansion in the 7th century. The second wave of the Justinian Plague struck the Byzantine Empire just as it was beginning to recover from the initial outbreak 2 decades earlier. This recurrence killed another estimated 1 to 2 million people and definitively ended any hope of restoring Roman imperial glory. Emperor Justinian I, who had survived the first wave, now faced a second demographic catastrophe that completed the empire's economic and military collapse. The plague struck during ongoing wars with Persia and barbarian invasions, making recovery impossible. Unlike the first outbreak, which hit a relatively stable empire, this second wave struck a civilization already weakened by decades of warfare and disease. The cumulative impact of both plague waves reduced the Byzantine Empire's population by an estimated 40 to 50%, making it impossible to maintain the large armies and complex administration required for a major empire. The plague's recurrence also demonstrated the cyclical nature of pandemics. Even after a population develops some immunity, new outbreaks can occur as immunity wanes or the pathogen evolves. This second wave effectively ensured that the Mediterranean world would never again be united under a single empire, fundamentally changing the political landscape of Europe and the Middle East for centuries to come. The Black Death remains history's most devastating pandemic, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, it arrived in Europe via trading ships from Asia, carried by fleas on black rats. The plague manifested in 3 deadly forms: bubonic, causing massive swollen lymph nodes; pneumonic, attacking the lungs; and septicemic, poisoning the blood. Entire villages vanished, cities became graveyards. The social order collapsed as nobles and peasants died equally. Trade networks crumbled, religious faith wavered, and labor shortages were so severe that survivors could demand higher wages, inadvertently ending feudalism in many regions. The plague's psychological impact was equally devastating. Art became obsessed with death, and many believed the apocalypse had arrived. Europe didn't recover its pre-plague population for over 200 years. Some historians argue that without the demographic collapse, the Renaissance might never have happened, as the massive social upheaval created opportunities for new ideas and social mobility. The English sweating sickness was a mysterious disease that struck England in 5 major outbreaks between 1485 and 1551, each time threatening to devastate the kingdom. The disease was characterized by sudden onset of fever, headache, and profuse sweating, with victims often dying within 24 hours. The rapid progression was terrifying. People could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. The disease particularly affected the wealthy and educated classes, unlike most epidemics that hit the poor hardest. This social pattern was so unusual that it sparked numerous theories about the disease's nature. The 1528 outbreak was particularly severe, killing thousands and forcing King Henry VIII to flee court multiple times to avoid infection. The disease struck during crucial periods of English history. The first outbreak coincided with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field, while later outbreaks occurred during Henry VIII's reign and the English Reformation. The mysterious nature of the disease, combined with its tendency to kill quickly and its preference for the upper classes, created widespread panic and social disruption. The disease disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, with no clear explanation. Modern theories suggest it may have been a viral infection, possibly a hantavirus, though the exact cause remains unknown. The outbreaks demonstrated how even a localized epidemic could threaten political stability and social order in early modern Europe. The next plague on our list didn't just kill millions, it nearly erased an entire culture from history. The Cocoliztli Epidemics were catastrophic disease outbreaks that struck Mexico during Spanish colonial rule, killing an estimated 5 to 15 million indigenous people, and nearly causing the complete collapse of Mesoamerican civilization. The name Cocoliztli comes from the Nahuatl word meaning pest or disease. The exact pathogen remains debated, but recent research suggests it may have been Salmonella, possibly Salmonella paratifici, brought by Spanish colonizers. The first epidemic, 1545 to 1548, killed an estimated 5 to 8 million people, while the second, 1576 to 1580, killed another 2 to 2.5 million. Combined with earlier smallpox outbreaks, these epidemics reduced Mexico's indigenous population by an estimated 80 to 90%. Entire cultures and languages disappeared. The demographic collapse was so severe that it changed the global climate. Abandoned farmland regrew into forests, removing so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that it may have contributed to the Little Ice Age. The epidemics facilitated Spanish conquest and colonization, as indigenous resistance became impossible with such massive population loss. The social and cultural destruction was unprecedented. Complex civilizations that had existed for millennia were reduced to scattered survivors in just a few decades. London's Great Plague was the last major outbreak of Bubonic plague in England, killing an estimated 100,000 people, roughly 25% of London's population. The plague struck during the summer of 1665, spreading rapidly through the city's overcrowded and unsanitary neighborhoods. The wealthy fled to the countryside, leaving the poor to face the disease alone. Entire families died within days, and mass graves were dug to handle the mounting corpses. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys recorded the horror, describing streets filled with dead carts collecting bodies and red crosses painted on infected houses with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Trade ceased, businesses closed, and social order nearly collapsed. The government imposed harsh quarantine measures, locking infected families in their homes and posting guards to prevent escape. Quack remedies proliferated as people desperately sought protection. Everything from wearing amulets to smoking tobacco was tried. The plague finally ended in late 1666, possibly due to the Great Fire of London, which destroyed much of the medieval city and its rat population. The outbreak demonstrated how plague could still devastate major cities even in the 17th century, and it influenced the development of public health measures and urban planning in subsequent centuries. The third cholera pandemic was the deadliest of 7 global cholera pandemics, killing over 1 million people in Russia alone and spreading across Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. Caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, cholera spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation in rapidly industrializing cities. The pandemic coincided with increased global trade and travel, allowing the disease to spread faster than ever before. In London, The 1854 outbreak in Soho killed 616 people in just 10 days and led to the famous discovery by Dr. John Snow that cholera spread through contaminated water, not miasma or bad air. Russia was devastated, with entire villages wiped out and major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg seeing massive death tolls. The pandemic exposed the horrific living conditions of the Industrial Revolution, where overcrowded cities with no sanitation systems became perfect breeding grounds for disease. The social and political consequences were enormous. Cholera riots broke out across Europe as desperate populations blamed authorities, foreigners, or religious minorities. The pandemic ultimately led to major public health reforms and the beginning of modern sanitation systems. The third pandemic of bubonic plague began in China's Yunnan province and spread globally via steamship trade routes, lasting over a century. Unlike previous plague pandemics, this one was truly global, reaching every continent except Antarctica. The pandemic killed over 12 million people, with China and India suffering the worst casualties. Hong Kong became a major transmission hub, with plague-infected rats spreading via ships to cities worldwide. Major outbreaks occurred in Mumbai, San Francisco, Sydney, and ports throughout South America and Africa. The pandemic's long duration, over 100 years, made it unique among major disease outbreaks. In India alone, over 10 million people died, devastating the subcontinent's economy and society. The pandemic struck during the height of European colonialism, and colonial authorities often imposed harsh quarantine measures that sparked riots and political unrest. Ironically, this pandemic led to major medical breakthroughs, including the identification of the plague bacterium and the role of fleas in transmission. The development of antibiotics in the 1940s finally brought the pandemic under control. Though plague continues to exist in rodent populations worldwide, the Russian flu pandemic of 1889 to 1890 was the first pandemic of the modern transportation era, spreading rapidly via new railroad networks across Europe and steamships across oceans. The pandemic killed approximately 1 million people worldwide, with mortality rates of about 0.15%. What made this pandemic particularly significant was its speed. It circled the globe in just 4 months, demonstrating how modern transportation could accelerate disease spread. The pandemic likely began in Central Asia before reaching St. Petersburg and spreading westward. European cities were hit hard, with London, Berlin, and Paris seeing massive outbreaks. The pandemic reached New York within weeks of hitting Europe, then spread across North America. Recent genetic analysis suggests this may have been caused by the H3N8 influenza strain, or possibly even an early coronavirus similar to COVID-19. The pandemic struck during a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization, with crowded cities providing ideal conditions for spread. It was the first pandemic covered extensively by modern media, creating global awareness of the threat. The rapid global spread served as a warning of what future pandemics might look like in an interconnected world, though the lesson wouldn't be fully heeded until the 1918 Spanish flu demonstrated the devastating potential. Despite its name, the 1918 Spanish flu likely originated in the United States before spreading globally during World War I. This H1N1 influenza virus was uniquely deadly, killing an estimated 50 to 100 million people, more than the war itself. What made this pandemic particularly terrifying was its tendency to kill healthy young adults, not just the elderly and infirm. The virus caused a cytokine storm, where the body's immune system overreacted and attacked healthy tissue. Soldiers packed into trenches and ships spread the disease rapidly, and 3 successive waves swept the globe. In some communities, entire families died within days. Cities ran out of coffins and gravediggers. The pandemic struck as the world was already exhausted by 4 years of brutal warfare, compounding the crisis. Some remote communities, like certain Alaskan villages and Pacific islands, were completely wiped out. The flu changed the course of history. It may have influenced the outcome of World War I, contributed to the German defeat, and certainly affected the peace negotiations. The pandemic also accelerated medical research and public health initiatives. Though effective vaccines wouldn't arrive for decades, the HIV/AIDS pandemic has killed over 36 million people since its identification in 1981, making it one of history's deadliest pandemics. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, attacks the immune system, leaving victims vulnerable to opportunistic infections and cancers. The virus likely jumped from chimpanzees to humans in Central Africa in the early 20th century, but wasn't recognized until gay men in Los Angeles and New York began dying from rare diseases in 1981. The early response was hampered by stigma, as the disease initially affected marginalized communities: gay men, drug users, and minorities. Entire generations were lost in some African countries, where HIV prevalence reached 30% of adults in some regions. The pandemic devastated economies, destroyed families, and created millions of orphans. In some countries, life expectancy dropped by over 20 years. The social impact was equally severe. Stigma and discrimination made the pandemic worse, while conspiracy theories and denial by some governments allowed the virus to spread unchecked. However, the pandemic also sparked unprecedented medical advances, activism, and international cooperation. Antiretroviral treatments have transformed HIV from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition, though the virus continues to spread, particularly in developing countries. Thank you for watching this video and making it to the end. Which plague here was most shocking to you? And are there any other pandemics you think should have made this list? Let us know in the comments.